Imagine this. Imagine waking up one morning with the strange realization that every moment you wish you could erase, every heartbreak, every failure, every long night staring at the ceiling, has been quietly shaping you into someone you don't yet recognize. Not stronger in the way motivational posters promise, not happier in the shallow sense, but deeper, sharper, more awake. Now imagine the opposite, a life without friction, no rejection, no loss, no anxiety, no humiliation, just comfort, ease, and uninterrupted pleasure. It sounds like paradise, but sit with it for a moment, really sit with it. Who would you become in that world? Would you develop courage if nothing ever threatened you? Would you discover compassion if you never tasted pain? Would you search for meaning if everything came effortlessly? Or would you slowly fade into something softer, duller, less alive? Here, the unsettling paradox. Everything in you that matters most may have been forged in moments you wish never happened. Yet you've been taught to treat suffering as a mistake, as an enemy, as something to anesthetize with distractions, prescriptions, scrolling, shopping, or empty affirmations. From a young age, you learn that pain means something has gone wrong. That discomfort is a signal to escape. That sadness is a malfunction. That anxiety must be silenced. So you run. You run from grief. You run from loneliness. You run from uncertainty. You run from the quiet voice inside that asks uncomfortable questions. You chase productivity, entertainment, relationships, status, anything that keeps you from sitting alone with what hurts. But what if this entire strategy is backwards? What if the very experiences you're trying to eliminate are the ones carrying the most important messages of your life? Think about it. Why does suffering force you to stop, while comfort lets you drift? Why do crises provoke transformation, while stability often breeds stagnation? Why do people rarely change when things are going well, but radically reinvent themselves when everything falls apart? You don't discover your limits during easy days. You discover them when you're broken open. You don't meet your deepest values while coasting. You meet them when something you love is threatened or lost. You do confront who you really are when life feels safe. You confront it when you're pushed into a corner and stripped of your usual identities. And still you resist. You tell yourself that once the pain is gone, then you'll grow. Once the anxiety disappears, then you'll become confident. Once life stabilizes, then you'll find clarity. But look honestly at your own story. Were your most important realizations born in comfort or in chaos? Did you learn who mattered during moments of abundance or moments of loss? Did you find your strength when everything was working or when everything collapsed? Suffering has a way of cutting through illusions. It dismantles false priorities. It exposes the masks you didn't know you were wearing. It forces questions you've been postponing for years. And that's precisely why it terrifies you. Because suffering doesn't just hurt, it reveals. It shows you where you're living out of alignment. It shows you what you've been avoiding. It shows you the distance between who you are and who you could become. Most people spend their entire lives trying to escape this mirror. But what if, instead of running from it, you turn toward it? What if your suffering isn't a punishment, but an invitation? To understand why this possibility exists at all, why pain seems woven into human development, why modern society fights it so desperately, and why your psyche responds to it in such strange ways, you first have to uncover the hidden machinery beneath your experience. And that's where the real story begins. The hidden problem isn't that you suffer. It's that you've been taught to misunderstand it. From the moment you become conscious of yourself, you're quietly trained to see pain as a defect in the system, a glitch to be corrected, an obstacle between you and the version of life you think you're supposed to be living. Schools reward compliance and performance, not introspection. Workplaces celebrate productivity, not inner clarity. Social media amplifies polished smiles while concealing private despair. Even the language you inherit is biased toward avoidance. Stay positive, move on, don't dwell, be grateful. Everything happens for a reason. These phrases sound compassionate, but often they function as spiritual anesthesia. They teach you to bypass the very experiences that could transform you. Carl Jung warned about this more than a century ago. He observed that what you refuse to face in yourself doesn't disappear, it sinks into the unconscious. There it becomes what he called the shadow, the collection of rejected emotions, instincts, fears, and desires that operate outside your awareness. You don't eliminate suffering by ignoring it. You internalize it. And once it lives in the shadows, it begins to shape your behavior in indirect, often destructive ways. You become irritable without knowing why. You sabotage relationships without understanding the pattern. You feel empty even when your life looks successful. You develop compulsions, addictions, and anxieties that seem to appear out of nowhere. But they don't come from nowhere. They come from everything you didn't allow yourself to feel. Nietzsche took this even further. He believed that suffering was not only unavoidable, it was essential. In his view, modern culture was becoming dangerously allergic to discomfort, and in doing so, it was producing weaker souls. Not physically weaker, but existentially weaker. Less capable of confronting reality, less willing to wrestle with meaning, less prepared to bear responsibility for their own lives. He argued that growth requires tension and that without struggle there is no becoming. His idea of amor fati, loving your fate, wasn't passive acceptance. It was a radical embrace of everything that happens to you, especially the parts that hurt, not because pain is pleasant, but because it is formative. Arthur Schopenhauer offered a darker diagnosis. He saw life as fundamentally saturated with dissatisfaction. Desire leads to frustration. Fulfillment leads to boredom. Pleasure is temporary, but longing is constant. From his perspective, suffering is woven into the structure of existence itself. Yet even here, there's an uncomfortable insight. If suffering is inevitable, then your resistance to it becomes an added layer of torment. You suffer, and then you suffer about suffering. Jean-Paul Sartre approached the problem from another angle. He argued that you are condemned to freedom, that you are always responsible for how you interpret and respond to your circumstances. Even in pain, you are choosing, whether consciously or not. You choose your attitude. You choose your narrative. You choose whether to see yourself as a victim of experience or an active participant in it. And this is where things become unsettling. Because if suffering can be interpreted, then it can also be wasted. Viktor Frankl discovered this in the most extreme conditions imaginable. Surviving Nazi concentration camps, he observed that people who found meaning in their suffering, even the smallest, most fragile sense of purpose, were far more likely to endure than those who saw themselves as merely broken by it. His conclusion was stark. Pain without meaning destroys you. Pain with meaning transforms you. But modern society offers you almost no framework for meaning. Aldous Huxley foresaw this with chilling accuracy. He warned that future generations wouldn't be controlled through brute force, but through pleasure and distraction. Not through oppression, but through endless entertainment. When everything is available instantly, dopamine, validation, stimulation, you lose your capacity to sit with discomfort. You lose your tolerance for boredom. You lose your ability to reflect. And without reflection, suffering becomes unbearable. So you reach for your phone, you open another tab, you fill your calendar, you numb out, you stay busy, you stay stimulated, you stay occupied with noise. All the while, the deeper questions wait patiently beneath the surface. Who are you beneath your coping mechanisms? What parts of yourself have you abandoned to survive? What truths are your symptoms trying to communicate? This is the hidden problem. You live in a culture that teaches you to escape pain, while your psyche is designed to speak through it. Every wave of anxiety, every ache of loneliness, every sense of emptiness carries information. It points toward unresolved conflicts, unmet needs, suppressed desires, and unlived potentials. But instead of listening, you silence the signal. And when the signal is silenced long enough, it gets louder. It becomes chronic stress. It becomes depression. It becomes addiction. It becomes a quiet despair you can't quite name. This is not a personal failure. It's a collective misunderstanding. You were never taught how to suffer. See, when suffering is misunderstood, it doesn't stay contained within your inner world. It leaks. It leaks into the way you speak to people you love, into the choices you make when no one is watching, into the ambitions you chase and the fears you refuse to admit. It quietly reshapes your personality, your relationships, and your sense of what's possible, often without your consent. You may believe you're making rational decisions, but much of your behavior is driven by unexamined pain. This is where the trap becomes invisible. Your brain is not designed to seek truth. It is designed to seek safety. Neurologically, it prioritizes threat avoidance and reward acquisition. Anything associated with discomfort gets tagged as dangerous. Anything that offers quick relief gets reinforced. Over time, this creates powerful feedback loops. You avoid what hurts. You repeat what numbs. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your world shrinks. You stop having difficult conversations because they make you anxious. You abandon creative impulses because they expose you to judgment. You stay in unfulfilling situations because uncertainty feels worse than dissatisfaction. You settle, not because you consciously choose to, but because your nervous system has learned that familiarity is safer than growth. This is not weakness, it's conditioning. Psychologists call this experiential avoidance, the tendency to escape internal discomfort even when doing so causes long-term harm. It's one of the core drivers behind addiction, procrastination, and emotional detachment. You don't drink, scroll, binge, or overwork because you're immoral or lazy. You do it because, in that moment, relief feels more urgent than meaning. But every time you choose short-term comfort over long-term truth, something subtle happens. You teach yourself that you can't handle reality. That lesson accumulates. Cognitive biases reinforce it. Negativity bias makes painful memories more vivid than positive ones. Confirmation bias leads you to collect evidence that supports your existing fears. Learned helplessness convinces you that your efforts don't matter after repeated disappointments. Over time, these mental shortcuts create a quiet internal narrative. This is just how I am. This is just how life is. And so you adapt, not by becoming more alive, but by becoming more manageable. You lower your expectations. You dull your sensitivity. You trade curiosity for certainty. You build an identity around coping instead of becoming. Yet beneath that adaptation, something restless remains. You feel it in moments of silence, in the strange emptiness after achieving something you once desperately wanted, in the quiet envy you feel toward people who seem more authentic, more daring, more awake. You feel it when you lie in bed at night and sense that you're living a fraction of your potential. That restlessness is not a flaw. It's a signal. But because you were never taught how to listen to it, you misinterpret it as anxiety, boredom, or dissatisfaction. You try to fix it externally, new goals, new relationships, new environments, without realizing that the unease is coming from inside. This misunderstanding doesn't stop at the individual level. Zoom out, and you begin to see its collective effects. A society that avoids suffering becomes obsessed with image, with productivity, with optimization. People learn to perform happiness instead of cultivating depth. Vulnerability becomes weakness. Stillness becomes laziness. Reflection becomes inefficiency. You're encouraged to brand yourself, monetize your passions, and turn your identity into a product. You're told to stay busy, stay positive, stay distracted. There's little space for grief, little tolerance for ambiguity, little patience for inner work. So unresolved pain finds other outlets. It becomes aggression in comment sections. It becomes polarization in politics. It becomes scapegoating of outsiders. It becomes the quiet cruelty of indifference. When people don't know how to sit with their own suffering, they project it outward. They look for enemies. They cling to simplistic narratives. They seek control where understanding feels too difficult. This is how personal avoidance becomes cultural dysfunction. Even your sense of self is shaped by it. When you don't process suffering, you start constructing identities around protection rather than expression. You become the strong one, or the funny one, or the successful one. You wear roles like armor. They keep you functioning, but they also keep you hidden. And the longer you live this way, the harder it becomes to remember who you were before the armor. You may appear composed on the outside while feeling fragmented within. You may be admired while feeling unseen. You may be surrounded by people while feeling profoundly alone. This is the unseen cost of running from pain. Not dramatic collapse, not obvious tragedy, but a slow erosion of aliveness. You begin to experience life through filters instead of directly. You react instead of choose. You survive instead of create. You become a manager of symptoms rather than an explorer of meaning. And here's the most haunting part. Because suffering is avoided rather than integrated, it keeps repeating. The same relationship patterns resurface. The same emotional triggers appear in different forms. The same inner conflicts cycle through new circumstances. Life feels like it's teaching you the same lesson over and over again, just with different characters and settings. That's not coincidence. That's unfinished business. Until suffering is faced, it returns. Until its message is heard, it speaks louder. Until its energy is transformed, it manifests as anxiety, resentment, exhaustion, or despair. You can't outrun it, but you can learn to meet it differently. And that requires something radical, something that goes against almost everything you've been taught. It requires a rebellion. Not against society, not against other people, but against your own instinct to escape. Because the moment you stop running is the moment everything begins to change. The rebellion doesn't begin with changing your circumstances. It begins with changing your relationship to discomfort. This is where everything turns upside down. You've been conditioned to believe that freedom comes from eliminating pain. That peace arrives when your problems are solved. That confidence appears once fear disappears. But the people who actually transform their lives don't wait for suffering to end. They learn how to walk directly into it. Not recklessly, not masochistically. Consciously. This is the radical shift. Instead of asking, how do I get rid of this feeling? You begin asking, what is this feeling trying to teach me? That single question changes the entire architecture of your inner world. When anxiety arises, you don't immediately distract yourself. You sit with it. You notice where it lives in your body. You observe the thoughts attached to it. You ask what threat it believes it's protecting you from. Often, beneath the surface, you find unmet needs, suppressed anger, or a truth you've been avoiding. When sadness arrives, you don't label it as weakness. You let it move through you. You allow yourself to grieve what was lost, what never happened, or who you've had to become to survive. Grief, when welcomed, has an intelligence of its own. It reorganizes priorities. It deepens empathy. It clears space for something new. When shame appears, instead of pushing it away, you trace it back. Whose expectations are you carrying? Which parts of yourself did you learn to hide? What story about yourself has been running in the background for years? This is shadow work in its rawest form. Carl Jung described it as making the unconscious conscious, not to become perfect, but to become whole. The goal isn't to eradicate your darkness, it's to integrate it. Your anger contains boundaries. Your fear contains sensitivity. Your envy contains information about unlived desires. Even your destructive impulses are distorted expressions of something vital. Nothing inside you is random. Everything is trying to protect you, express you, or complete you. This is why avoidance keeps you stuck, while curiosity sets you free. Historically, every meaningful transformation followed this same pattern. Nietzsche spoke of the Übermensch not as a superhero, but as someone who had passed through their own inner chaos and emerged with self-authored values. Viktor Frankl found meaning in suffering by orienting himself toward responsibility and purpose, even in a concentration camp. Ancient initiation rites across cultures forced individuals into symbolic death through isolation, hardship, or fear, before welcoming them back as adults. They understood something modern culture has forgotten. You are not reborn through comfort. You are reborn through confrontation. So how do you begin? First, you stop outsourcing your inner life. You stop expecting therapists, partners, substances, or success to do the work for you. Support matters, but responsibility is yours. No one else can feel your feelings. No one else can face your fears. No one else can live your truth. Second, you practice radical honesty. You tell yourself the truth about your relationships, your habits, your compromises. You notice where you're numbing out. You admit where you're settling. You acknowledge the gap between who you are and who you sense you could become. This is uncomfortable. That's the point. Third, you build tolerance for emotional intensity. You train your nervous system to stay present when things get hard. This might mean slow breathing when panic rises, writing when thoughts feel chaotic, sitting quietly when your instinct is to reach for stimulation. The goal isn't to feel good, it's to stay conscious. Over time, this rewires your response to stress. What once overwhelmed you becomes workable. What once controlled you becomes information. Fourth, you take responsibility for small, courageous actions. Not dramatic life overhauls, not grand declarations, just consistent steps that align with your values, difficult conversations, creative risks, healthier boundaries, saying no when you mean no, saying yes when fear tells you to hide. Each act of courage teaches your psyche that you are capable. And capability is the foundation of confidence. You also begin reframing your past. Instead of seeing your wounds as evidence of defect, you start seeing them as training. The betrayal that taught you discernment, the failure that forced humility, the loneliness that pushed you inward, the heartbreak that cracked you open. You stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" You start asking, "What did this awaken in me?" This doesn't romanticize trauma. It doesn't excuse injustice. It simply recognizes that meaning can be forged from anything, that even the darkest chapters can become sources of wisdom, strength, and compassion. And as this shift takes root, something remarkable happens. You stop needing life to be easy in order to be okay. You stop waiting for perfect conditions before you begin living fully. You realize that power doesn't come from controlling circumstances. It comes from meeting reality without flinching. This is the rebellion. Not loud, not dramatic. Quiet, internal, relentless. A refusal to abandon yourself in moments of pain. A willingness to walk through fire rather than around it. And once you do, you begin to sense that suffering was never your enemy. It was your initiator. Which brings you to the final realization. The one that changes how you see everything you've endured and everything still to come. There comes a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when everything rearranges itself inside you. Not because your life suddenly becomes easy, not because your pain magically disappears, but because you finally understand what it was all pointing toward. You realize that suffering was never meant to break you. It was meant to introduce you to yourself. Every disappointment, every betrayal, every season of confusion was a kind of summons, a call to grow beyond the version of you that could only survive and step into the version that can choose, create, and endure with awareness. This is the ultimate truth. Your suffering is not random. It arrives precisely at the edges of your evolution. Think about that. Pain shows up where you've outgrown old identities. Anxiety emerges where you're living out of alignment. Grief appears when something false is being stripped away. Emptiness surfaces when you've been chasing substitutes for meaning. Each experience marks a threshold, an invitation to expand. You were never meant to remain who you were. Life is a continuous process of psychological death and rebirth. Old beliefs dissolve, old roles collapse, old dreams fall apart, and each time this happens, you face a choice: cling to what no longer fits or step forward into uncertainty. Most people cling. They try to resurrect past versions of themselves. They replay old stories. They negotiate with reality. They stay loyal to identities that once kept them safe but now keep them small. But growth demands something braver. It demands surrender. Not resignation, not passivity. Surrender to truth. Surrender to the fact that you are always becoming, and that resistance only prolongs the transition. This is what existential philosophers were pointing toward. Sartre insisted that you are not defined by what happens to you, but by what you make of it. Frankl showed that even in unimaginable suffering, you retain the freedom to choose your stance. Jung revealed that wholeness requires embracing both light and shadow. Nietzsche urged you to transform pain into strength through conscious affirmation of your fate. They were all circling the same realization from different angles. You are forged through what you are willing to face. And once you truly grasp this, your relationship with life changes. You stop asking for fewer challenges. You start asking for deeper courage. You stop wishing for comfort. You begin cultivating resilience. You stop seeing hardship as a detour. You recognize it as the path. Your scars become symbols of survival, not shame. Your sensitivity becomes intelligence, not weakness. Your past becomes a source of insight, not a prison. You no longer define yourself by what wounded you, but by what you learned, what you integrated, and who you chose to become in response. Even your fears start to look different. Fear is no longer just something to escape. It becomes a compass. It points toward the edges of your growth. The things that terrify you often carry the seeds of your transformation, speaking your truth, leaving what no longer nourishes you, creating something meaningful, allowing yourself to be seen. On the other side of fear is not safety. It's aliveness. And then there is compassion. Not the shallow kind that avoids discomfort, but the deep kind that recognizes suffering in others because you've met it in yourself. You become gentler without becoming weak, stronger without becoming hardened. You stop needing to dominate, impress, or prove. You start listening. You start understanding. Your pain connects you to humanity. It reminds you that everyone you meet is carrying something invisible. That anger is often grief in disguise. That arrogance often hides insecurity. That indifference often masks exhaustion. You become less reactive and more present. And presence is power. This is what it means to turn suffering into wisdom. Not by glorifying it, but by letting it reshape you. So when the next wave comes, and it will, you meet it differently. You don't immediately reach for distraction. You don't collapse into old narratives. You don't ask why life is doing this to you. You pause. You breathe. You listen. You ask, what is being asked of me now? Maybe it's patience. Maybe it's boundaries. Maybe it's courage. Maybe it's rest. Maybe it's letting go. Whatever it is, you trust that this moment, too, belongs to your becoming. Because now you see the pattern. Every breakdown carried a breakthrough inside it. Every loss made space for something truer. Every period of darkness refined your perception. You were never falling apart. You were being reassembled. And as this understanding settles in, something profound happens. You stop waiting for life to start. You realize it's been happening all along. in the sleepless nights, in the silent tears, in the uncomfortable realizations, in the moments you thought you were lost. Those were not interruptions. Those were initiations. So stand where you are, right here in the middle of your imperfect, unfinished story, and recognize what you've survived, what you've learned, and what is still unfolding. Your suffering was not the end of you. It was the doorway. And now that you've walked through it, you carry something rare. Not certainty, not invincibility, but depth. And with depth comes freedom. With freedom comes responsibility. And with responsibility comes the power to shape your life, not despite what you've endured, but because of it. That is the gift hidden inside your pain. And once you see it, you can never unsee it.